Chapter 2. When Elizabeth came to, she wished she hadn't. She was lying on a sumptuous red velvet couch in a large, spacious living room. She had been changed from her riding pants and chaps into a stylish gown. This was not a surprise, as she was fully aware that upon her arrival, regardless of her unconscious state, Stanton would have ordered his maids to change her immediately. He resented her tendency to wear men's clothing, and demanded that she was always ladylike in her attire, attitude, and demeanor. Her head hurt, and it took a while for her eyes to focus. The door burst open, and a well-tailored, well-built man entered the room. "I've been hearing things, Elizabeth. In fact, I just heard that you've been a very naughty girl." "You can't believe everything you hear, Mr. Stanton."
"Elizabeth, I've asked you 1,000 times to call me Maxwell."
"Yes, you have." She swept a hand through her hair. He sauntered over and mimicked her hand with his, slowly smoothing it through her silky locks. His grip tightened on a fistful, and using the hair as leverage, he snapped her face up to look directly at his.
"I will have you, Elizabeth Marie, one way or another."
A low rumbling from outside gave little warning of the burst of light which suddenly permeated the room as lightning rent the sky. Another boom of thunder announced a heavy downpour of rain, which created its own thunderous sound against the rooftop. If Maxwell hadn't been distracted by the flashes of lightning and the deafening roar of the present weather conditions, he might have discerned a different type of storm brewing within Elizabeth's eyes, a tempest that more than rivaled the one outside. Maxwell let go of her.
"Don't make me regret having spared you, Elizabeth. You may be tough, but you are not invincible, and you are," he chuckled, "merely a woman."
She stood up defiantly and walked away from the sofa and from Maxwell. "I may be just a woman, but I am a woman that you want and cannot have. I refuse to marry you," she continued before he could interrupt, which he'd intended to do. "You reneged on the deal, Mr. Stanton, so my ethics now permit me to do the same. And let me be perfectly clear when I say that I feel absolutely no compunction in withdrawing from my part of the bargain." To her surprise, he laughed, but his dark eyes smoldered, warning her of the danger he imposed.
"Elizabeth, my darling, I did not break my word or renege on our deal."
"You promised not to kill Paxton if I told him it was over and that I had committed to marry you."
"Ah, well, I promised no one would see him hang, that there would be no public execution. Now, no one saw him die, did they? Don't look so dismayed, my dear. He died an honorable death, and his name remains unmarred."
He advanced on her and deftly touched her pale cheek.
"Aside from that, my sweet, how could I marry you while your husband still lived?"
He pulled her into an embrace and held her tightly so she could not break free.
You seem to have forgotten what he said about you. Have you?" Although she didn't believe it possible, his grip tightened even more, causing her to whisper breathlessly, "No." He smiled cruelly. "Well, I would like to make sure. Why don't you repeat it to me?" "He said he hated me, that he would kill me if he ever saw me again, and that marrying me was the biggest mistake he had ever made." Satisfied with her response, he loosened his grip. "How could I let a man like that, a man that threatened you, live? I know you were miserable with him, that he treated you abhorrently with his affairs, his drinking, and his gambling. I will never treat you in such a manner. You will be my goddess, and I will possess you and mold you so carefully that in time you will come to appreciate me and our life together." Elizabeth was sure that he wished to add, "or else." His words were grossly inaccurate and darkly fringed with insinuated threats. One of the tools Maxwell had used to manipulate her was the threat of ruining Paxton's reputation with vicious lies. Paxton had never had an affair, and he rarely drank or gambled. Her eyebrows lowered mutinously. "I am not a piece of clay to be molded and possessed," she thought. "Oh, Pax, if you only realized I still love you, that I did it all for you, that what I said was said because of duress, would you want me back again?" A tear escaped down her cheek. Maxwell lifted her face and dusted away the tear. "I knew you would be as happy as I am about our future and the way I plan to indulge you," he said. "Tears of joy are just streaming down your face, my darling." He lowered his lips to hers. They were cold, and somehow seemed to sting as his kiss grew more insistent. "Elizabeth, why make me wait until our wedding night? Let me make love to you now. I want you." Involuntarily, she lurched backward and cried, "No!" His eyes flashed with brutal fire, and he grabbed her arms and held them painfully. "You are mine, Elizabeth. I can take you whenever I want." Yes, he could. He was not above murder or corruption, she knew that. His dark eyes and hair were analogous with his shadowy nature, and for Elizabeth his character removed any hint of handsomeness that might have been there had he been an honest and respectable man. He was just a big shot whose family had profited well from the gold rush. He'd come into their little village and bought out several of the ranchers that had toiled most of their lives on their land. If the men refused to sell, Maxwell forced them out, and his methods were cruel and overpowering. Elizabeth's father had been one of those ranchers, only Maxwell was unable to use veiled threats or force her father to move. He had stood his ground. So Maxwell had him murdered. Elizabeth was certain of it. But his body had never been found, and that was several years ago now. When her father first disappeared, the sheriff, whose services Maxwell had obviously bought, told her that her father had left on urgent business and asked Mr. Stanton to watch over the ranch for him until he returned. She was then only 14 and had little choice but to stay on the ranch, hoping more than believing that his story was true. For 3 years Maxwell transformed the ranch and fired her father's hired hands one by one
until she was the only original occupant left. One day Maxwell called her in to see him, which rather alarmed her, since he'd basically ignored her existence, although he'd provided her with a decent education. Surprisingly enough, he'd hired the best private tutors, which Elizabeth appreciated. As soon as she had entered the dining room, he'd stared at her as if he'd never seen her before. After recovering from his astonishment, he confirmed she was 17, complimented her on her looks, and showed her a letter. He explained that he'd received the letter only weeks after her father had left, but he hadn't had the heart to show her at the time. The letter was supposedly from her father, indicating he would not be returning, and that he gave the ranch and all its entireties to Mr. Stanton, giving Elizabeth a modest sum of money for her well-being. Stanton then informed her he'd deducted her education from the sum, and that was why it seemed smaller than what she would have expected. Telling her she was welcome to stay on the ranch, he looked her up and down in a way that revealed all too clearly that his intentions were not entirely honorable. She'd glared at him, incensed by the whole meeting. In the back of her mind, she was tempted to argue she'd never asked for the education, but he probably would have smoothly replied that her father had requested it. She also realized a reproach on the money he owed her for work on the ranch would have been just as pointless. He'd dismiss it, claiming her work paid her maintenance. True, he'd never asked her for board, but surely that was due to guilt at having murdered the only family she had. As for the letter, Elizabeth knew it was entirely false. Her father would never have abandoned her or the ranch, and he certainly would not have asked Maxwell Stanton to maintain it. He hated him. Elizabeth recalled her father ranting at the dinner table about how evil, cruel, and unethical Mr. Stanton was. Of course, her father didn't refer to him as Mr. Stanton. He'd dubbed him the bullying big-shot gold-digger. She had attempted to oppose the letter, but her youth prevented her from making any real impact on anyone. And all of the ranch hands that could have backed her up were gone. Merely smiling, the sheriff told her not to be upset about her meager inheritance, and that her father probably realized she'd have a hard time running the ranch. The sheriff seemed to take great pleasure in assuring her Maxwell Stanton would take good care of her. Oh, yes, she was very sure he would. If she displeased him, she'd end up as dead as her father. Despairing, Elizabeth returned to the ranch, left a note with enough money to purchase velvet, and left her beloved home. During the years after her departure, Maxwell had mutated the village into a town, filled it with Stanton supporters, and had himself elected mayor. Granted, the town was extremely prosperous, and the people there were relatively happy, but it had been built on the blood and toil of others. And if Stanton was corrupt, then so was the town. She looked up at the man whom she had more reason to hate than any other, and realized this was no time to offend him. She had to be careful, or he could make things worse for her. She smiled shakily. "I'm not denying you out of spite, Maxwell. I'm an honorable woman, you know that, and that is one of the reasons I insist on waiting until our wedding night." Seductively skating a fingertip over his bottom lip, she whispered, "I look forward to giving myself to you for the first time as husband and wife, and for our first night to be a special, meaningful communion. Please don't deny me that." She hoped this tactic would succeed. His look softened. "Oh, all right, my dear. I suppose I can wait one more day. I have, after all, moved up the wedding." He assessed her carefully. "I don't want to take any chances of you getting away." She kept her face soft and masked her true emotions as well as she could. "Lovely. I can hardly wait to be Mrs. Elizabeth Stanton," she lied. Maxwell might not have been convinced, but at least he was placated. He walked toward the exit, but then he paused, turning to her and smiling. "Elizabeth, I never agreed for you to take Velvet. I didn't make a fuss about it, because you did pay more than enough for her, and I realized what she meant to you. Your father gave her to you as a colt, didn't he? But I am taking her back into my possession for now. I will give her back to you as a wedding present. Good night, my love." He shut the door behind him and locked it. Willie was waiting outside the door. Maxwell looked at him angrily and hissed, "Are you sure Paxton Rain is dead?" Willie shifted uneasily, as he was not entirely sure. After he'd thrown an unconscious Elizabeth onto her horse, he'd gone in search of Rain, but all he found was a recently dug grave not a stone's throw away from the tree. He'd been tired and looking forward to dinner, and couldn't be bothered to search for a man that was likely as dead as his wife had confessed him to be. Willie recalled how furious Stanton had been that Elizabeth had escaped in the first place, and then been relocated near where they had strung up her husband. Willie, not wanting any more verbal abuse from the mayor, or to increase the chance of losing his job, and perhaps even his life, had assured him Rain was dead. He was well aware that his boss wanted to make sure nothing could stand in his way of marrying Elizabeth legally, that nothing could stand in his way of possessing her entirely. "He's dead, sir," Willie declared. Maxwell's eyes narrowed as he assessed the short, beefy man that stood in front of him. Willie had been born a bastard on the estate of Mr. and Mrs. Romulus Stanton, Maxwell's parents. Willie's mother, as it so happened, was one of Mrs. Stanton's favorite maids, and hence she was very adamant in her refusal to dismiss the maid on the grounds of impropriety. Romulus was furious with both his wife for her unusual opposition to his desires, and with the behavior of her maid. He was, however, persuaded to permit the baby to stay when he was promised the mother would take full responsibility in covering their living expenses. In exchange for providing mother and child with a home, he would ultimately receive the lifelong service of the boy. Although Mr. Stanton was fully aware that the benefit of this bargain was entirely on his side, and unfairly so, he accepted, and as generosity was not in his nature, Romulus never stopped behaving as if he was still the one at a disadvantage because of it. So it was that Willie had grown up alongside of the illustrious Stanton children, and his mother never let him forget what a great
blessing this was. Upon the unexpected death of his wife, just before Maxwell's 16th birthday, Romulus, realizing that Willie had few relevant uses, had gifted Willie's services to his youngest son. Maxwell, who absolutely refused to grieve for his mother, felt this was the one decision of his father's he was truly grateful for. Unknown to any of the Stantons, or to Willie, Maxwell had been observing Willie since he himself was a 4-year-old child, and had long since discovered his few talents. He was extremely loyal to the Stanton family, to whom he felt he owed his life, a feeling that had been bred into him by his mother. In Maxwell's mind, that devotion alone, when mixed with his more disreputable qualities, such as greed, stupidity, malice, lust, and brutality, made for a perfect puppet. Then, barely 16, Maxwell believed himself a masterful puppeteer. Willie was only a few years older than the mayor, but his keen inclination to smoke like a wetwood fire, booze, gamble, and womanize had aged him greatly. "He is dead, sir," Willie repeated, uneasy with the way the mayor was scrutinizing him. "Good. Tomorrow I marry Elizabeth." Maxwell Stanton nodded decisively, and went to his room, no doubt, Willie thought begrudgingly, to get his beauty sleep for the big day. Willie shrugged and sauntered off. He had better things to do than worry about the mayor and his desires. It was, after all, highly unlikely that Rain could have lived for 3 days in the unmerciful heat of the sun, without food or water. There was a grave, and Elizabeth herself had said she'd buried him, or what was left of him. "Yeah, he's a goner," Willie thought, convincing himself there wouldn't be further trouble from Elizabeth's bothersome husband.